July 30th, 1975. A hot summer afternoon in Detroit. A man walks into a restaurant parking lot for what seems like an ordinary meeting. But this wasn't an ordinary man. This was Jimmy Hoffa, the most powerful labor leader in America. By 2:30 p.m., he had vanished without a trace. His car sat empty, no witnesses, no body, no answers for 50 years. America has been haunted by one question: what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Tonight, we're taking you on the complete journey from a coal miner's son in Indiana to the president of the most powerful union in America. From his battles with the Kennedys to his connections with the mob, and finally to that fateful day when he disappeared forever. But before we dive into this incredible story, I need to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop your location in the comments right now. Are you listening to this late at night during your commute? Let me know, and if you're ready for the most detailed, well-researched deep dive into Jimmy Hoffa's entire life. The untold stories, the shocking connections, the mystery that still haunts us, then hit that subscribe button right now. Smash that like button and make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. This is going to be epic. Let's get into it. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1930, in the small coal mining town of Brazil, Indiana, Viola Riddle Hoffa gave birth to her third child. She named him James Riddle Hoffa, though he would carry his middle name, his mother's maiden name, like a mark of destiny. The world he entered was one of relentless hardship, grinding poverty, and the kind of backbreaking labor that killed men young. Brazil, Indiana, was not a place of romance or opportunity. It was a company town, its existence justified solely by the coal that lay beneath the earth, and the men willing to descend into darkness to extract it. The town's lifeblood was black dust that coated everything: homes, churches, schools, lungs. Men coughed it up in the morning and breathed it in at night. It was the price of survival in industrial America. Jimmy's father, John Hoffa, was a coal driller, a man who spent his days in the suffocating blackness of underground mines, drilling holes for dynamite charges, breathing air thick with rock dust and coal particles. It was dangerous work that paid poverty wages. Mine collapses, gas explosions, and black lung disease claimed lives with grim regularity. John Hoffa was a German-American, descended from immigrants who had come to America, seeking opportunity, and found instead the brutal reality of industrial capitalism. He was a quiet man, steady and hardworking, who believed that if a man simply put his head down and worked hard, he could provide for his family. Viola Hoffa was cut from different cloth, born Viola Riddle. She was of Pennsylvania Dutch stock, practical, religious, and possessed of an iron will that would define her son's character. She believed, as Jimmy would later write, that duty and discipline were spelled with capital D's. She ran her household with firm authority, instilling in her 4 children, Janetta, Jimmy, Nancy, and Billy, the values that working-class families clung to: honesty, hard work, loyalty to family, and the understanding that nobody was going to give you anything in this world. You had to take it. The Hoffa household was crowded, noisy, and poor, but it was held together by Viola's indomitable spirit. Meals were simple: beans, potatoes, cornbread, whatever could stretch to feed 6 mouths on a driller's wages. Clothes were patched and repatched, passed down from one child to the next. Luxuries were non-existent, but there was love, and there was the stubborn pride of people who refused to be broken by circumstances. Young Jimmy grew up playing in the coal dust streets of Brazil, a small, scrappy kid with boundless energy and a quick temper. Even as a child, he displayed the qualities that would define his adult life. He was fiercely protective of his siblings, quick to fight when challenged, and possessed of a charisma that drew other children to him. He was a natural leader, organizing the neighborhood kids into games and adventures, settling disputes, standing up to bullies. Teachers noted his intelligence and his stubbornness in equal measure. He was smart enough to excel in school, but independent enough to question authority when he thought it was wrong. But the Hoffa family's precarious stability shattered in 1920 when Jimmy was just 7 years old. John Hoffa, who had spent years breathing coal dust in the mines, developed a chronic lung condition. The cough that had always been present grew worse. More persistent, he grew weak, unable to work. In an era before workers' compensation, disability insurance, or medical benefits, an injured worker was simply cast aside. There was no safety net. The mine company owed John Hoffa nothing, and they gave him nothing. The family watched helplessly as John Hoffa slowly suffocated, his lungs destroyed by years of coal dust exposure. He died in agony, drowning in his own lungs, a casualty of the industrial machine that had consumed him. He was 35 years old for 7-year-old Jimmy Hoffa. His father's death was a defining moment that would echo through his entire life. He watched his father, a good man, a hard worker who had played by the rules, die because the system offered no protection for men who broke their bodies in service of profit. He saw the coal company offer no compensation, no pension, no acknowledgement of his father's sacrifice. He watched his mother, a widow at 31 with 4 children and no income, struggle to keep the family from disintegrating. "I saw what happened to my father," Hoffa would later say. "I saw what happens to working men in this country when they've got nobody to fight for them. I swore I'd never let that happen to me, and I'd never let it happen to other men if I could help it." In that moment, though he could not have articulated it, Jimmy Hoffa's life path was set. He would never trust the benevolence of employers. He would never believe that the system was designed to protect working people. He would never accept that workers should be powerless. And he would spend his life fighting, with whatever weapons he could find, to give working men and women the power to defend themselves. Viola was not a woman to surrender to circumstances. Widowed with 4 children and no income, she made the hardest decision of her life. She would leave Brazil, Indiana, and move the family to Detroit, Michigan. It was 1924, and Detroit was booming. The automobile industry had transformed a mid-sized industrial city into the manufacturing capital of the world. Henry Ford's assembly lines were revolutionizing production. Jobs were plentiful for those willing to work hard. Viola Hoffa had always been willing to work hard. The family settled in a working-class neighborhood on Detroit's west side, in a small house that seemed luxurious compared to their coal dust dwelling in Brazil, but was in reality just another cramped accommodation for poor families. Viola took whatever work she could find, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, cleaning houses for wealthier families. It was exhausting, poorly paid work, but it put food on the table. The older children pitched in as soon as they were able. 11-year-old Jimmy took odd jobs after school, delivering newspapers, running errands, doing whatever a kid could do to bring in a few coins. Detroit in the 1920s was a city of contradictions. The automobile industry was creating unprecedented wealth, but that wealth flowed upward to investors and executives, while the workers who actually built the cars struggled to survive. The assembly lines that Ford had pioneered were marvels of efficiency, but they reduced human beings to components in a machine, performing the same repetitive task thousands of times a day at a pace dictated by the inexorable movement of the line. Workers were pushed to exhaustion, injured on the job, and discarded when they could no longer keep up. For a young man growing up in this environment, the lessons were clear. The rich got richer, the workers got used up, and if you wanted to survive, you needed to be tough, smart, and willing to fight. Jimmy Hoffa absorbed these lessons in his bones. School held little appeal for young Jimmy. He was bright enough. Teachers consistently noted his intelligence and his ability to think quickly, but he was restless. bored by abstract lessons when the urgent reality of poverty pressed in on all sides. What did algebra matter when his mother was working herself to exhaustion? What good were history lessons when there were bills to pay and mouths to feed? At 14 years old, in 1927, Jimmy Hoffa made a decision that would have been controversial if his family had any other choice. He dropped out of school. He had completed 8th grade. And that was the end of his formal education. Years later, some would point to his limited schooling as evidence of his unsophistication. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his education. Jimmy Hoffa was about to enroll in the hardest school in America, the school of survival in the urban working class. And he would graduate with honors. His first job was as a stockboy at a department store, hauling boxes, organizing inventory, running errands. The pay was minimal, the hours long, the work mind-numbing, but it was money. And money meant survival. He moved from job to job, always looking for something better, always learning, always watching how systems worked and where the power lay. In 1930, at age 17, Hoffa landed a job that would change his life. He became a freight handler at a Kroger grocery warehouse on Detroit's west side. It was brutal work, unloading boxcars and trucks, stacking 100 lb sacks of produce, working in sweltering heat in summer and bitter cold in winter. The warehouse was a raw, masculine environment where physical strength and mental toughness were the only currencies that mattered. The job paid 32 cents an hour, but even that pittance was conditional. Workers were hired on a casual basis. They would show up at the warehouse in the morning, and a foreman would select which men would work that day. If you were chosen, you might work 4 hours or you might work 16, depending on how much freight arrived. If you weren't chosen, you went home with nothing. There was no security, no benefits, no recourse. The foreman had absolute power, and he exercised it with the arbitrary cruelty of petty tyrants everywhere. Jimmy Hoffa quickly learned how the system worked. The foreman played favorites, selecting men who were willing to kick back part of their wages, or who would run errands for him, or who simply knew how to grovel. The work pace was punishing. Speed up. Load faster, no breaks, no complaints. Injuries were common. A man who couldn't keep up was simply discarded. But Hoffa also noticed something else. The workers, for all their individual toughness, were powerless because they were divided. Each man competed against the others for the foreman's favor. For the chance to work united, they could have tremendous power. The warehouse couldn't function without them. Divided, they were helpless. It was a lesson in power dynamics that Hoffa never forgot. The Great Depression slammed into America in 1929, and by 1932, it had transformed the country into a landscape of desperation. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment reached 25% nationally. And in industrial cities like Detroit, it was even higher. Bread lines stretched around blocks. Families were evicted from their homes. Men who had once held good jobs stood on street corners selling apples for nickels, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. For workers at the Kroger warehouse, conditions deteriorated even further. With so many desperate men competing for so few jobs, employers could push harder, pay less, treat workers worse. What were they going to do, quit? There were 100 men waiting to take their place by 1932. Jimmy Hoffa had been working at the warehouse for 2 years. At 19 years old, he was no longer a boy. Standing 5 feet 5 inches tall, he was compact and powerfully built from years of manual labor. His hands were calloused, his shoulders broad, his manner direct and confident. He had the respect of his fellow workers. They recognized in him something different. He didn't grovel to the foreman. He didn't play the usual games. He worked hard. But he also spoke up when things were unfair, and increasingly, other workers came to him with their complaints, looking for leadership. The breaking point came on a spring day in 1932. when a shipment of fresh strawberries arrived at the warehouse. Strawberries were a premium product, perishable, valuable, and time-sensitive. They needed to be unloaded and distributed immediately, or they would spoil. The foreman, seeing an opportunity to squeeze more productivity out of his workers, announced that the freight handlers would work through their usual dinner break to unload the strawberries. There would be no extra pay for most of the workers. This was just another indignity in a long series of indignities. You accepted it because you had no choice, but Jimmy Hoffa saw something different. He saw leverage. During a brief break, Hoffa gathered a group of the workers, men he had been talking to for months about their shared grievances. "We don't touch those strawberries," he said simply. "Not until they agree to better conditions." It was a revolutionary statement. These were not union men. They had no organization, no strike fund, no legal protection. They were casual workers who could be fired on a whim. But Hoffa's logic was irrefutable. The strawberries would rot. Kroger would lose thousands of dollars. The company needed them more than they needed any individual worker. The key was unity. If even a few men agreed to work, the strike would collapse. Hoffa moved through the warehouse, talking to each man individually, explaining the plan, building solidarity. He appealed to their pride, their anger, their sense of fairness. He promised to stand with them, to be the spokesman, to take the heat. His charisma, his confidence, his evident sincerity won them over. When the foreman ordered the strawberry shipment unloaded, every single freight handler refused. The foreman threatened, he cursed. He warned them they would all be fired. Hoffa, acting as spokesman, calmly explained that the workers had some demands: better hourly wages, a minimum guarantee of hours for workers who showed up, better treatment from management, and no retaliation for this job action. Until those demands were addressed, the strawberries would sit, hour by hour. The strawberries softened in the summer heat. The foreman called the warehouse manager. The manager called corporate headquarters. Angry executives calculated losses. The freight handlers stood firm, with young Jimmy Hoffa as their leader and spokesman. After several tense hours, management capitulated. They agreed to negotiate. The workers got their raise. Not as much as they wanted, but more than they had. They got a guarantee of minimum hours, and most importantly, they learned the lesson that would echo through the labor movement: united workers have power. For Jimmy Hoffa, the strawberry strike was an epiphany. He had discovered his calling years later. He would say, "That's when I learned that you could fight City Hall. When you're organized, when you stick together, when you show them you're willing to sacrifice, you can win." Word of the young organizer at the Kroger warehouse reached the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Local 299 in Detroit. The Teamsters, founded in 1903, represented truck drivers, warehouse workers, and others in the transportation industry. They were looking for organizers, tough men who could handle themselves in rough situations, who could relate to workers, who could build loyalty. Jimmy Hoffa fit the profile perfectly. In 1933, at age 20, Jimmy Hoffa officially joined the Teamsters Union. It was not just a job, it was a revolution in his life. He had found his purpose, his community, and his path to power. He was no longer just Jimmy Hoffa, freight handler. He was Jimmy Hoffa, union man, and he would never look back. The early 1930s were formative years for Jimmy Hoffa in every sense. As he dove deeper into union organizing, he was learning the brutal realities of labor politics in Depression-era America. Union organizing wasn't a matter of polite negotiations and civilized debate. It was warfare. Companies hired private security forces and goons to intimidate workers. They fired union sympathizers. They brought in strikebreakers. They used every legal and illegal method available to crush organizing efforts. Hoffa learned to fight back with equal ruthlessness. Organizing campaigns often involved physical confrontations, setting up picket lines that companies would try to break through. facing down company security, protecting union members from retaliation. Hoffa was fearless in these situations, willing to take a beating if necessary, but more often giving one. He was building a reputation as a tough, reliable organizer who got results. It was during one of these organizing campaigns in 1936 that Jimmy Hoffa met the woman who would become his lifelong partner. Her name was Josephine Pashiwak, and like Hoffa, she came from working-class immigrant stock. Her parents were Polish immigrants who had come to Detroit seeking a better life. Jo, as everyone called her, was working at a laundry and had joined the union picket line. She was 21 years old, pretty, practical, and possessed of the same no-nonsense toughness that characterized Hoffa himself. According to the story Hoffa loved to tell, he first noticed Jo on the picket line and was immediately smitten. She was arguing with a strikebreaker, holding her ground, not backing down. Hoffa admired that kind of courage. He approached her, introduced himself, and asked if he could walk her home after the picket shift. She agreed, and that began a courtship that was both romance and partnership. Jo understood Jimmy in a way that few people did. She recognized his burning ambition, his commitment to the labor cause, and his essential decency beneath the tough exterior. She also understood that being married to Jimmy Hoffa would mean sharing him with the union, that his first loyalty would always be to the working men and women he represented. She accepted this without resentment, because she believed in the same cause. They were married in 1936 in a simple ceremony, befitting their working-class backgrounds. There was no honeymoon. Hoffa was in the middle of an organizing campaign and couldn't spare the time. Jo didn't complain. She was marrying a man on a mission, and she would be his partner in that mission for the rest of their lives together. The marriage produced 2 children, Barbara Ann, born in 1938, and James P. Hoffa, born in 1941. Jo ran the household with the same firm discipline that Viola Hoffa had employed, creating stability and normalcy for the children, even as their father's career grew increasingly demanding and dangerous. She shielded them from the worst aspects of union politics, from the threats and violence that were part of that world. She created a home that was a sanctuary from the battles Jimmy fought every day. For Hoffa, his family was sacred, a reminder of what he was fighting for. He was building a labor movement to protect families like his own, to ensure that working men could provide for their wives and children, to prevent the kind of tragedy that had devastated his own family when his father died. The personal and the political were inseparable in Hoffa's worldview. Jimmy Hoffa's rise through the Teamsters hierarchy was meteoric, driven by his extraordinary ability to organize workers, negotiate contracts, and expand the union's power. In 1933, he was appointed as a business agent for Local 299, a position that made him a full-time union representative. By 1937, at just 24 years old, he was elected president of Local 299, making him one of the youngest local union presidents in the country. His success was based on a simple formula: deliver results for the membership. Hoffa negotiated better wages, better working conditions, better benefits. He was accessible to members. They could call him at any hour, bring him their problems, count on him to fight for them. He built fierce loyalty because he earned it through tangible improvements in workers' lives. But Hoffa also understood that power came from expansion. A single local, no matter how well run, had limited leverage. Real power required coordination across multiple locals, across regions, across the entire industry. He began building alliances with other Teamsters leaders, consolidating locals into larger councils, creating structures that could bargain with companies on a broader scale. In the early 1940s, Hoffa formed the Michigan Conference of Teamsters, bringing together locals from across the state under unified leadership. He became chairman of the Central States Drivers' Council by 1940, and president of the Michigan Conference by 1942. Each position brought more power, more members, more leverage. His organizing tactics were innovative and aggressive. He understood that trucking was the circulatory system of American commerce. Goods moved by truck from factories to warehouses to stores. If the Teamsters could control trucking, they could control the economy. He organized not just truck drivers, but warehouse workers, dock workers, anyone involved in the movement of goods. He negotiated contracts that included hot cargo clauses, provisions that allowed Teamsters to refuse to handle goods from non-union companies, effectively forcing those companies to unionize or go out of business. He was also willing to use any tactic necessary to win. If a company refused to negotiate, Hoffa would organize a strike. If they tried to use strikebreakers, Hoffa's men would set up picket lines that were impenetrable. If companies resorted to violence, Hoffa responded with violence. In the rough-and-tumble world of 1940s labor politics, these tactics were not exceptional. They were necessary for survival. Critics would later point to Hoffa's willingness to use intimidation and violence as evidence of his corruption. But Hoffa saw it differently. "You can't be a nice guy when you're dealing with these companies," he said. "They'll walk all over you. You've got to show them you're tough, that you won't back down, that there's a price for fighting the union. That's the only language they understand." By 1947, Hoffa's reputation had grown to the point that he was appointed as a trustee on the General Executive Board of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the union's governing body, in 1952. He became an international vice president. He was moving into the upper echelons of power in the largest, most powerful union in America. But he was also attracting attention from another quarter, law enforcement, the FBI. And congressional investigators were beginning to take interest in the connections between unions and organized crime. And Jimmy Hoffa, whether he liked it or not, was about to become the most investigated labor leader in American history. The relationship between Jimmy Hoffa and organized crime is one of the most controversial and debated aspects of his career. Critics portray him as little more than a mob puppet, a labor leader who sold out the union to criminal interests. Defenders argue that he worked with the mob because it was necessary to survive and succeed in the environment of mid-century American labor relations. The truth, as is often the case, is more complex than either narrative suggests. To understand Hoffa's relationship with the Mafia, one must understand the context of American unions in the 1940s and 1950s. Organized crime had infiltrated many unions, particularly in industries where cash flow was high and oversight was limited. Dock workers, construction, trucking, entertainment, garbage collection. The reasons were simple. Unions had money in the form of dues and pension funds, political influence, and the ability to control key industries. The mob provided services that unions sometimes needed: muscle for picket lines, enforcement of contracts, intimidation of strike breakers and hostile employers. In return, mob figures gained legitimate employment for their members, access to union funds, and influence over valuable industries. In cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, the boundary between unions and organized crime was often blurred to the point of invisibility. Jimmy Hoffa's first significant mob connection came through William "Billy" Bufalino, a Detroit attorney who represented both Teamsters locals and various mob figures. Through Billy Bufalino, Hoffa met Russell Bufalino, a powerful mob boss in the northeastern Pennsylvania crime family. Russell Bufalino would become one of Hoffa's key mob connections, a relationship that would last until Hoffa's disappearance in Detroit. Hoffa developed relationships with the city's mafia leadership, particularly the Giacalone family. Tony Giacalone would later be one of the men Hoffa was supposed to meet on the day he disappeared. In Chicago, he worked with mob-connected Teamsters officials. In New York, he dealt with leaders of the 5 families who controlled labor racketeering in that city. Hoffa was pragmatic about these relationships. In his view, he was using the mob, not the other way around. When he needed muscle for an organizing campaign, mob connections could provide it. When he needed political influence, mob figures could deliver it. When he needed to control troublesome rival unions or local leaders, mob enforcement could handle it. He saw it as a business relationship, mutually beneficial, but not one where he was subordinate. I deal with whoever I need to deal with to get results for my members, Hoffa once said in a moment of candor. If that means talking to people that nice folks don't approve of, that's the price of doing business in the real world. But the relationship went both ways. And over time, the mob extracted its price. The most significant asset the Teamsters controlled was its pension fund, officially called the Central States Southeast and Southwest Areas Pension Fund by the late 1950s. This fund contained hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, eventually growing to over $300 million. It was supposed to provide retirement security for Teamsters members. Instead, under Hoffa's leadership, it became what the FBI would later describe as the most abused, misused pension fund in America. The pension fund made loans to various businesses, and many of those loans went to mob-connected enterprises, casinos in Las Vegas, the Stardust, the Dunes, the Fremont. Caesar's Palace received pension fund financing, real estate developments, hotels, and various other businesses with mob connections received favorable loans. The terms were often generous, the oversight minimal, and the repayments sometimes questionable. The mob had found a virtually unlimited source of capital, and Hoffa was the gatekeeper. Did Hoffa personally profit from these deals? The evidence suggests that he did not take significant kickbacks. His personal lifestyle remained relatively modest. He lived in a nice but not extravagant house, drove decent cars, and did not display the kind of wealth that would suggest large-scale corruption. But he did gain political capital. The mob connections gave him power to control the union, power to intimidate rivals, power to get things done that couldn't be accomplished through legitimate channels alone. The moral question that haunts Hoffa's legacy is this: was his alliance with organized crime a necessary evil in an era when corporations also used illegal tactics? Or was it a betrayal of the working people he claimed to serve? Did the ends better wages and conditions for Teamsters members justify the means? These questions would be debated for decades, but in the moment, Hoffa made his choice. He would use whatever tools were available to build power for his union, and if that meant making deals with devils, so be it. Throughout the 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa served under Teamsters General President Dave Beck, a Seattle-based labor leader who had built the union into a national powerhouse. Beck was a skilled negotiator and organizer, but he was also, as would be revealed, deeply corrupt. He used union funds for personal expenses, maintained sweetheart deals with employers, and ran the union as a personal fiefdom. Hoffa learned from Beck, both from his strengths as a negotiator and from his vulnerabilities as a corrupt leader, whose personal greed would eventually destroy him. Hoffa was building his own power base in the Midwest and South, organizing locals, building the Central States Conference, creating a network of loyalists who would support him for the union's top position when the opportunity arose. That opportunity came in 1956 when the U.S. Senate established the Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, commonly known as the McClellan Committee after its chairman, Senator John McClellan, Arkansas. The committee's chief counsel was a young, ambitious attorney named Robert F. Kennedy, and their target was union corruption. With the Teamsters at the top of the list, the McClellan Committee hearings, which ran from 1957 to 1959, were televised spectacles that captivated the nation. Dave Beck was called to testify and faced with evidence of his corruption, invoked the Fifth Amendment over 140 times in a single session. It was a public relations disaster. Evidence showed that Beck had used union funds to pay for his personal expenses, had accepted payoffs from employers, and had betrayed the trust of his membership. Beck was finished, and everyone knew it. The question was, who would succeed him? Hoffa was the obvious choice. He had the largest power base, the most loyal following, and the organizational skills to run the union. But he also had Robert Kennedy's focused attention. Kennedy had identified Hoffa as the real power behind the Teamsters, and more importantly, as the embodiment of everything Kennedy thought was wrong with American labor unions: the corruption, the mob connections, the willingness to use violence and intimidation. Kennedy was from a wealthy, privileged background, educated at Harvard, driven by a sense of moral righteousness. Hoffa was from the streets, educated by hard experience, driven by a working-class resentment of the privileged elite. When Hoffa appeared before the McClellan Committee, the confrontation between Kennedy and Hoffa was electric. Kennedy peppered him with questions about mob connections, questionable pension fund loans, and instances of violence. Hoffa was defiant, combative, refusing to be intimidated. He answered questions carefully, admitted nothing, and gave Kennedy no satisfaction. "I'm not going to be pushed around by some rich kid whose father bought him a position," Hoffa reportedly said privately. Kennedy, for his part, saw Hoffa as a thug and a criminal who needed to be behind bars. Despite Kennedy's best efforts, Hoffa could not be prevented from ascending to the presidency. In October 1957, at the Teamsters Convention in Miami Beach, Jimmy Hoffa was elected General President of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters by a 3-to-1 margin. At 44 years old, he had reached the pinnacle of his career. He now led the largest, most powerful labor union in the United States, over 15 million members and growing. In his acceptance speech, Hoffa made clear his priorities. "I'm going to work 20 hours a day, 6 days a week for the members of this union. I'm going to negotiate better contracts, better wages, better benefits than any union in American history. And nobody, not the government, not the employers, not anybody, is going to stop me." He made good on that promise, but he had also made powerful enemies. And those enemies would spend the next decade trying to destroy him. From the moment he assumed the presidency in 1957, Jimmy Hoffa approached the position with a level of energy and commitment that was almost superhuman. He worked 20-hour days, 6 days a week, sleeping only a few hours a night. He traveled constantly, visiting local unions, meeting with members, negotiating contracts, putting out fires. He made his office phone number available to any Teamster who wanted to call him. And he actually answered the phone himself, listening to grievances, solving problems, maintaining direct contact with the rank and file. This accessibility was unprecedented for a union president. Most labor leaders of that era had become bureaucrats, insulated from the membership by layers of staff and protocol. Hoffa deliberately rejected that model. He wanted members to know that he was one of them, that he hadn't forgotten where he came from, that their problems were his problems. His vision for the Teamsters was revolutionary: to consolidate the union's bargaining power on a national scale. Before Hoffa, most Teamsters contracts were negotiated locally or regionally. This meant that trucking companies could play one local against another, threatening to move operations to wherever wages were lowest. Workers in different regions were competing against each other rather than standing together. Hoffa saw that this fragmentation weakened the union. His solution was audacious: create a national master contract that would cover all over-the-road truck drivers simultaneously. Every trucking company would have to meet the same wage standards, the same benefit requirements, the same working conditions. Competition would be based on efficiency and service, not on who could pay workers the least. It took 7 years of relentless negotiation, persuasion, and arm twisting, but in 1964, Hoffa achieved his masterpiece, the National Master Freight Agreement. This single contract covered over 400,000 truck drivers across the United States, the largest collective bargaining agreement in American history up to that point. It standardized wages, created uniform working conditions, established pension and health benefits, and gave truck drivers middle-class incomes and security. The impact was transformative. A truck driver in the 1950s had been a working-class laborer, often living paycheck to paycheck with no job security and minimal benefits. By the mid-1960s, thanks to Hoffa's National Master Freight Agreement, that same truck driver earned a solid middle-class income, had health insurance for his family, had a pension waiting for retirement, and had the respect and dignity that comes with economic security. Congressman Elmer Holland, speaking on the floor of the House of Representatives, captured the significance. Jimmy Hoffa has put more bread and butter on the tables for American kids than all his detractors put together. This was Hoffa's greatest achievement, the creation of economic opportunity and security for hundreds of thousands of working families. Under his leadership, the Teamsters grew to over 23 million members, making it not just the largest union in America, but one of the most powerful economic and political forces in the country. What is less remembered about Hoffa's tenure as Teamsters president is his progressive stance on civil rights, a position that put him ahead of many of his contemporaries in the labor movement and in American society. Generally in the 1950s and early 1960s, many unions remained segregated or maintained separate locals for black and white workers. Some union leaders openly opposed integration, fearing it would alienate white members, but Hoffa, drawing on his own experience of economic struggle and discrimination, refused to tolerate segregated locals within the Teamsters. "I don't care what color a man is," Hoffa said repeatedly. "If he's a working man, if he drives a truck or loads a warehouse, he's a Teamster, period. We don't have white locals and colored locals. We have Teamsters locals." He backed up his words with action. In the South, where segregation was most entrenched, Hoffa pushed for integrated locals, threatening to withhold union resources from locals that maintained discriminatory practices. He faced fierce resistance, not just from employers, but from white members who had been raised in a segregated society. But Hoffa was immovable. More remarkably, Hoffa supported Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement at a time when King was still a controversial figure, before he had achieved the universal admiration he would later receive. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, when many Americans, including many in the labor movement, viewed King as a dangerous radical, Hoffa provided financial support and political backing. The Teamsters contributed money to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Hoffa personally met with civil rights leaders. He instructed Teamsters locals to support integration and to hire black drivers and warehouse workers in an era when such positions were far from universally accepted. Hoffa's commitment to racial equality was genuine and consequential. His motivation was both moral and practical. Morally, he believed that workers should be judged by their work, not their skin color. Practically, he understood that a divided working class was a weak working class. If white and black workers were fighting each other, they couldn't unite against employers. Unity required equality. "You can't build a strong union on discrimination," Hoffa explained. "If you're telling some of your members they're second class, they're not going to give you their loyalty, and if you're dividing workers by race, the bosses will use that division to break you. We're all working people, and we've got to stick together, beyond contract negotiations and civil rights." Hoffa understood that political power was essential to protecting and advancing workers' interests. Laws determined whether workers could organize, how contracts were enforced, what benefits were taxable, and countless other issues that affected working families. If labor wanted to win, it needed political influence. In 1959, Hoffa created Drive Democratic, Republican, Independent Voter Education. Despite the bipartisan name, DRIVE was essentially a political action committee that would become one of the most powerful forces in American politics. It collected voluntary contributions from Teamsters members and distributed those funds to political candidates who supported labor-friendly policies. DRIVE's power came from its ability to mobilize voters. With over 2 million members, the Teamsters could swing elections in key states. A Teamsters endorsement brought not just financial contributions, but also volunteers for phone banks, door-to-door canvassing, and voter turnout operations. Politicians from both parties sought Teamster support. Hoffa wielded this power with strategic calculation. He didn't care about party labels, he cared about results. He supported Democrats who backed labor issues and Republicans who did the same. He opposed politicians who attacked unions, regardless of their party affiliation. This pragmatic approach made the Teamsters one of the most influential political organizations in the country. But it also made Hoffa enemies. Politicians who opposed labor saw him as a threat. Corporate interests saw him as an obstacle, and most significantly, the Kennedy family saw him as a dangerous adversary who needed to be neutralized. The animosity between Robert Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa was personal, visceral, and all-consuming. It went beyond policy disagreements or legal concerns. It was a clash of worldviews, values, and personalities. Robert Francis Kennedy came from one of America's most prominent political families. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr., had made a fortune in banking, bootlegging, and Hollywood before becoming U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom. Bobby Kennedy attended Harvard, served briefly in the Navy, and then entered politics. He was brilliant, driven, and possessed of an almost messianic sense of moral purpose. He believed in using power to right wrongs, to punish evildoers, to create a more just society. To Kennedy, Jimmy Hoffa represented everything wrong with organized labor. He saw Hoffa as a mobster in union clothing, a corrupt leader who had betrayed the working people he claimed to represent, a thug who used violence and intimidation to maintain power. Kennedy believed that exposing and prosecuting Hoffa would strike a blow against corruption and organized crime. To Hoffa, Robert Kennedy represented everything wrong with America's privileged elite. He saw Kennedy as a rich kid who had never worked a real job, never struggled for survival, never understood what it meant to be powerless. Kennedy had been handed every advantage in life: wealth, education, connections, and now he wanted to lecture working people about morality. Hoffa viewed Kennedy's crusade as nothing more than political grandstanding designed to build Kennedy's career. The personal nature of their conflict was evident from their first confrontation during the McClellan Committee hearings. When Kennedy questioned Hoffa aggressively, Hoffa responded with barely concealed contempt. When Kennedy wrote his book, The Enemy Within, in 1960, which portrayed Hoffa as a dangerous criminal, Hoffa sent Kennedy a mocking note. "I bought this book, and it was sickening. The money I spent on it, I want you to know, was not union funds." Kennedy, with characteristic wit, sent Hoffa a copy inscribed, "To Jimmy, I'm sending you this book so you won't have to use union funds to buy one." Bobby. It was a rivalry that would define both men's lives for the next decade. When John F. Kennedy won the presidency in 1960 and appointed his brother, Robert, as Attorney General in 1961, Jimmy Hoffa knew he was in serious trouble. Robert Kennedy now had the full resources of the federal government at his disposal, and he made clear that prosecuting Hoffa was among his top priorities. Kennedy created what became known as the Get Hoffa Squad, a dedicated team of federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and investigators whose sole mission was to build criminal cases against Hoffa. The team was led by Walter Sheridan, a former FBI agent who shared Kennedy's obsession with bringing Hoffa down. They investigated every aspect of Hoffa's life: his business dealings, His associates, his finances, his union activities. The resources devoted to this effort were extraordinary and unprecedented. Dozens of investigators worked full-time. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed. Financial records were subpoenaed. Hoffa was followed. His phones were tapped, though the legality of some of this surveillance was questionable. His associates were pressured to cooperate. Hoffa fought back with equal determination. He hired Edward Bennett Williams, one of the most brilliant criminal defense attorneys in America. Williams was a legal genius who had defended everyone from mobsters to politicians, and he was famous for his ability to win seemingly unwinnable cases together. Hoffa and Williams mounted an aggressive defense against every charge. The first major case came in 1962 when Hoffa was indicted in Nashville, Tennessee, for accepting illegal payments from a trucking company. The trial was a circus. Hoffa supporters packed the courtroom. The media covered every development, and tensions ran high. Williams mounted a brilliant defense, and the jury deadlocked. It was a victory for Hoffa, but only a temporary reprieve. Kennedy was undeterred. If one case didn't work, they would bring another, and another, and another. The strategy was to keep Hoffa constantly defending himself, draining his resources, keeping him off balance. Even if individual cases failed, the cumulative pressure might eventually break him. The breakthrough for Kennedy's team came in 1964 with the Chattanooga trial, but not in the way they initially expected. During the Nashville trial in 1962, members of Hoffa's team had allegedly attempted to bribe jurors. When this came to light, federal prosecutors brought charges of jury tampering and attempted bribery against Hoffa. The trial took place in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in early 1964. The prosecution's case was built on testimony from several witnesses, including a former Hoffa associate who had turned state's evidence. They presented evidence of a scheme to identify sympathetic jurors and offer them payoffs in exchange for votes to acquit. Williams mounted his usual vigorous defense, attacking the credibility of prosecution witnesses and arguing that the evidence was circumstantial. But this time, the jury was convinced. On March 4, 1964, Jimmy Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and attempted bribery. He faced up to 8 years in prison, but Kennedy wasn't finished. Even as the Chattanooga verdict was being appealed, federal prosecutors in Chicago brought another case against Hoffa, this one involving fraud and misuse of the Teamsters pension fund. The prosecution alleged that Hoffa had arranged for the pension fund to make a loan to a trucking company in which he had a hidden financial interest, and that he had conspired to conceal this conflict of interest. The Chicago trial took place in the summer of 1964. Once again, Williams defended vigorously. Once again, Hoffa maintained his innocence. But once again, the jury returned a guilty verdict. In July 1964, Hoffa was convicted of fraud and conspiracy to defraud the pension fund. He faced up to 5 years in prison on these charges, combined with the Chattanooga conviction. Hoffa was looking at a 13-year prison sentence. He was 51 years old if he served the full sentence. He would be 64 when released past his prime. His power broken, his empire likely controlled by others. True to his nature, Hoffa refused to go quietly. He immediately appealed both convictions, a process that would take years to work through the courts. In the meantime, he remained Teamsters General President, continuing to run the union, negotiate contracts, and maintain his power. The labor movement was divided in its response to Hoffa's convictions. Some unions and labor leaders defended him, arguing that he was being persecuted for his aggressive advocacy for workers, that the Kennedy administration was using the legal system to attack organized labor. Others, particularly the more conservative AFL-CIO leadership under George Meany, saw Hoffa as a liability who was bringing discredit to the entire labor movement. In 1964, The AFL-CIO expelled the Teamsters from its ranks. A significant symbolic blow. The official reason was corruption. But everyone understood it was specifically about Hoffa. The Teamsters, however, were powerful enough to survive on their own. Hoffa didn't need the AFL-CIO's blessing to negotiate contracts or maintain his membership. For 3 years, from 1964 to 1967, Hoffa fought his appeals while continuing to lead the union. He was defiant in public, maintaining his innocence, attacking Robert Kennedy as a politically motivated prosecutor. In private, he was more realistic. He knew the appeals would likely fail, that eventually he would have to go to prison. He began preparing for that eventuality, shoring up his control over the union, ensuring that loyal subordinates would maintain his power structure while he was incarcerated. His plan was to continue leading the union from prison, maintaining control through trusted lieutenants, and resume his position when he was released. Other labor leaders had done this successfully. Hoffa believed he could too. In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Robert Kennedy was devastated. His brother had been his closest friend and political partner. Kennedy resigned as Attorney General in 1964 and was elected to the Senate from New York in 1964. But the Get Hoffa squad continued its work under new leadership, and Hoffa's appeals slowly worked their way through the courts. In 1967, the Supreme Court declined to hear Hoffa's final appeal. He had run out of legal options. On March 7, 1967. Jimmy Hoffa reported to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to begin serving his 13-year sentence. He was 54 years old as he entered the prison. Hoffa made a statement to reporters, "I'll be back. I'll serve my time and I'll be back, and when I come back, the Teamsters will be stronger than ever. Nothing has changed. This is just a temporary setback." He was wrong about that. Everything was about to change. Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary was a medium security facility in central Pennsylvania. But for Jimmy Hoffa, it might as well have been the end of the world. The man who had commanded the loyalty of millions, who had negotiated with corporate titans and presidents, who had lived a life of constant action and power, was now reduced to prisoner number 33,298. The indignities began immediately. Like all new prisoners, Hoffa was subjected to a thorough intake process, strip-searched, including what he later described as humiliating anal cavity inspections, issued ill-fitting prison clothing, assigned to a small, cramped cell with a metal bunk, a toilet, and little else. The prison was overcrowded, violent and corrupt. Drugs circulated freely. Guards were often as brutal as the inmates. The food was barely edible. Hoffa was assigned to work detail in the prison mattress factory, where inmates would unstuff old, worn mattresses and then restuff them with new material. It was mind-numbing, physically demanding work. 40 hours, a week of repetitive labor that left him with constant nosebleeds from breathing the dust and fiber particles. For a man accustomed to running an organization of millions, negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, and wielding enormous power, the degradation was almost unbearable. "Prison is hell on earth," Hoffa wrote in letters to his family. "Only hell couldn't be this bad. They strip you of your dignity, your humanity, everything that makes you a person. You become a number. You eat when they tell you to eat, sleep when they tell you to sleep, work where they tell you to work, and if you complain, they make it worse." But Hoffa was not a man to break easily. He maintained his dignity through defiance. He refused to show weakness, refused to let the prison system crush his spirit. Other inmates recognized him. Many were Teamsters members or knew someone who was, and treated him with respect. He became a leader even in prison, helping other inmates with grievances, offering advice, maintaining his identity as someone who stood up for working people. He also maintained his connection to the union. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's longtime ally and vice president, was running the Teamsters in Hoffa's absence. Hoffa communicated with Fitzsimmons regularly through letters and occasional phone calls, giving instructions, receiving updates, trying to maintain control from behind bars. But distance and imprisonment inevitably eroded his power. Fitzsimmons, who had always been seen as Hoffa's loyal subordinate, was discovering that he liked being general president. He liked the power, the prestige, the autonomy, and he was receiving encouragement from people who preferred Fitzsimmons to Hoffa. Those people included organized crime figures. Hoffa had been difficult to control. He was too strong, too independent, too willing to fight. Fitzsimmons was more pliable, more willing to go along with what the mob wanted, less likely to ask difficult questions about pension fund loans. For the Mafia, having Fitzsimmons in charge was preferable to having Hoffa return. In prison, Hoffa channeled his frustration into writing. In 1970, he published The Trials of Jimmy Hoffa, a book that presented his version of events, his rise through the labor movement, his battles with the Kennedys, his conviction, which he maintained was unjust political persecution. The book is revealing both for what it says and what it doesn't say. Hoffa portrays himself as a champion of working people who was targeted by a privileged elite that couldn't tolerate his power. He admits to being tough, to using aggressive tactics, but insists that everything he did was for the benefit of Teamsters members. He denies any meaningful connection to organized crime, characterizing his relationships with mob figures as casual acquaintances at most. Critics dismissed the book as self-serving propaganda. Supporters saw it as an important corrective to the negative portrayal in Robert Kennedy's The Enemy Within. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. What's undeniable is Hoffa's bitterness toward Robert Kennedy. Large sections of the book are devoted to attacking Kennedy, his privileged background, his political motivations, his alleged abuse of prosecutorial power. Hoffa argues that Kennedy created the Get Hoffa Squad not out of concern for justice, but out of personal animosity and political calculation. He points out that other union leaders with similar or worse records of corruption were not subject to the same intense scrutiny. Bobby Kennedy didn't care about corruption, Hoffa wrote. He cared about getting Jimmy Hoffa. He cared about building his political career by destroying a powerful labor leader. It was personal, and it was political, and it was wrong. There's some truth to this. Kennedy's focus on Hoffa was extraordinarily intense and personal. Other labor leaders who were arguably more corrupt received far less attention. But that doesn't mean Hoffa was innocent of the crimes he was convicted of. Only that the prosecution was motivated by factors beyond simple law enforcement. By 1971, Jimmy Hoffa had served nearly 4 years of his 13-year sentence. He was 58 years old, and the prospect of spending another 9 years in prison was unbearable. He had exhausted his legal appeals. His only hope for early release was executive clemency, a pardon or commutation from the President of the United States. Richard Nixon was inaugurated as president in January 1969. Nixon was a Republican who had cultivated relationships with labor unions, particularly those that had broken with the liberal Democratic establishment. The Teamsters, expelled from the AFL-CIO and feeling isolated, were potential allies, and Nixon was pragmatic enough to see the political value of a relationship with the nation's largest union. Negotiations for Hoffa's release began in earnest in 1970. The intermediaries were Frank Fitzsimmons, who was developing a close relationship with the Nixon administration, and various Republican Party operatives. The Teamsters offered political support and campaign contributions. The Nixon administration offered the possibility of clemency for Hoffa, but there was a complication, Fitzsimmons, as negotiations progressed. It became clear that Fitzsimmons did not want Hoffa to return to power. He had grown comfortable in the president's office, and he knew that if Hoffa came back, he would immediately begin working to reclaim his position. So Fitzsimmons made a counteroffer to the Nixon administration. He would guarantee Teamsters support for Nixon's re-election in 1972, but only if Hoffa's release came with restrictions that would prevent him from returning to Union activity. The deal was struck on December 23, 1971. President Richard Nixon commuted Jimmy Hoffa's sentence. After serving 58 months, less than half his sentence, Hoffa was a free man, but there was a catch. The commutation included a restriction barring Hoffa from direct or indirect management of any labor organization until March 6, 1980, the date his original sentence would have ended. Hoffa was furious. He had agreed to no such restriction. He believed he had been betrayed by Fitzsimmons, by the Nixon administration, by the mob figures who preferred Fitzsimmons' pliability to Hoffa's strength. But he was out of prison, and he was determined to find a way back to power. "They think they can keep me out," Hoffa said to his family upon his release. "They think they can put me on a shelf and I'll just go away. They don't know me. I'm going to fight this restriction. And I'm going to get my union back. It's mine. I built it. And I'm going to have it back." It was a vow that would lead him 3.5 years later to a parking lot in suburban Detroit on a hot July afternoon. Jimmy Hoffa returned to his family home in Lake Orion, Michigan, a suburb north of Detroit, in December 1971, for the first time in decades. He had no office to go to, no meetings to attend, no phone ringing with calls from Teamsters members across the country. A man who had worked 20-hour days for most of his adult life suddenly had nothing but time. It was agonizing for him. His identity was wrapped up in the union. He was Jimmy Hoffa, Teamsters president. Without that role, who was he? A retired man spending his days at a lake cottage? That wasn't living. That was waiting to die. He immediately began planning his return. The restriction in his commutation barred him from direct or indirect management of any labor organization until 1980. Hoffa argued that this restriction was illegal, that Nixon had exceeded his constitutional authority by placing conditions on a commutation. His lawyers filed suit to overturn the restriction. While the legal case worked its way through the courts, Hoffa took a symbolic position. He returned to Detroit Teamsters Local 299, the local he had led decades earlier, and took a job as a rank-and-file member. He couldn't hold an official position, but he could be present, could talk to members, could maintain his visibility and connection to the union. He also began writing his autobiography, working with writer Oscar Fraley. The book, titled Hoffa, The Real Story, was his attempt to control his legacy, to present his version of his life and career to history. It would be published posthumously in 1975 after his disappearance, adding a haunting quality to its pages, but his real focus was on reclaiming his power. He cultivated relationships with local union officials, many of whom had come up through the ranks under his leadership and still revered him. He gave interviews to the press, maintaining his public profile. He attended union events unofficially, reminding people that he was still alive, still active, still Jimmy Hoffa. Frank Fitzsimmons had been Jimmy Hoffa's trusted lieutenant for years. He had risen through the Teamsters hierarchy under Hoffa's patronage, serving loyally as a vice president when Hoffa went to prison. Fitzsimmons was the obvious choice to serve as acting president. Everyone understood, or thought they understood, that he was keeping the seat warm for Hoffa's return. But power changes people. Fitzsimmons discovered that he liked being general president. He liked the respect, the influence, the substantial salary and benefits. He liked dealing with presidents and senators and corporate executives. He liked being Jimmy Hoffa's equal rather than his subordinate. And he was receiving very clear messages from people whose opinions mattered. They did not want Hoffa back. The organized crime families that had relationships with the Teamsters vastly preferred Fitzsimmons to Hoffa. Fitzsimmons asked fewer questions about pension fund loans. He was more cooperative, more flexible. less likely to assert his independence. Hoffa had always been difficult to control. He had his own agenda, his own power base, his own ideas. Fitzsimmons understood his role, facilitate what the mob wanted, and in return maintain his position. Corporate executives also preferred Fitzsimmons. He was more willing to make sweetheart deals, less militant in negotiations, more interested in maintaining cordial relationships with management. Hoffa had been a fighter who relished confrontation. Fitzsimmons was a deal-maker who preferred accommodation. Even the Nixon administration, which had arranged Hoffa's release, preferred Fitzsimmons. The Teamsters under Fitzsimmons had become reliable political allies, contributing money and organizational support to Republican candidates. Hoffa was unpredictable, independent, likely to support whoever served his interests regardless of party. Fitzsimmons was reliable. So when Hoffa began openly campaigning to overturn the restriction and return to the presidency, he encountered resistance from every quarter. Fitzsimmons refused to step aside. The Teamsters Executive Board, now filled with Fitzsimmons loyalists, showed no interest in facilitating Hoffa's return, and most ominously, mob figures began sending messages that Hoffa should back off, that his time had passed, that he should retire gracefully. Hoffa ignored these warnings. He had never backed down from a fight in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. He was convinced that if he could get in front of the rank-and-file membership, they would rally to him. He was still Jimmy Hoffa. The members still loved him. He could win an election if one were held fairly. But the people in power had no intention of letting that happen. By 1974, the situation was escalating. Hoffa's legal challenge to the restriction on his union activities was making progress through the courts. There was a real possibility that a federal judge might rule the restriction unconstitutional, clearing the way for Hoffa to run for union office again. Hoffa was openly stating his intention to challenge Fitzsimmons for the presidency at the 1976 Teamsters Convention. This prospect alarmed the people who had come to rely on Fitzsimmons's compliant leadership. The pension fund was at stake, hundreds of millions of dollars that flowed to mob-connected projects. Political influence was at stake, the Teamsters' support that had been carefully cultivated. Business relationships were at stake, the cozy arrangements between management and the union leadership. Hoffa began receiving warnings, some subtle, some not. Old friends advised him to give up the fight, to enjoy his retirement, to focus on his family. Union officials who had once been loyal to him now avoided him or told him bluntly that the situation had changed. And mob figures, people he had known for decades, let it be known that his campaign to return was not appreciated. Tony Provenzano was one of those sending messages. Provenzano was a New Jersey Teamsters official and a captain in the Genovese crime family. He and Hoffa had once been allies, but they had a falling out while both were in Lewisburg prison. The dispute was over pension benefits that Provenzano believed he was entitled to, but that Hoffa had blocked. Provenzano held a grudge, and he had the backing of the New Jersey mob. Tony Jack Giacalone was another concern. Giacalone was a powerful enforcer in the Detroit mob and someone Hoffa had known for years. But Giacalone's loyalties now lay with Fitzsimmons and the status quo. He was reportedly making it clear that Hoffa's return would not be welcome. Hoffa dismissed these concerns, at least publicly. "I'm not afraid of anybody," he told associates. "I've been fighting my whole life. I'm not going to stop now because some people don't like it. This is my union. I built it. Nobody's going to stop me from taking it back." But privately, he was more cautious. He told his wife, Josephine, about some of the warnings. He confided in his children. He made arrangements for his autobiography to be published, even if something happened to him. He was not naive about the dangers, but he was also not willing to surrender. By the summer of 1975, the situation had reached a critical point. Hoffa's legal case was progressing. The 1976 Teamsters Convention was approaching. Fitzsimmons and his allies, both in the Union and in organized crime, knew that if Hoffa succeeded in overturning the restriction, he would be a formidable candidate. Many rank-and-file members still revered him. He had the charisma, the track record, the credibility that Fitzsimmons lacked. Something had to be done. And according to the most credible theories about what happened next, that something was decided in meetings between mob figures from Detroit, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, meetings where Jimmy Hoffa's fate was sealed. Wednesday, July 30th, 1975. Dawned hot and humid in southeastern Michigan. It was the kind of oppressive summer day where the heat builds from morning onward, where the air feels thick and heavy, where people move slowly and look for shade. For most people in the Detroit suburbs, it was just another day in the middle of a difficult decade. The economy was struggling, unemployment was high. The optimism of the post-war years had given way to uncertainty and anxiety. For Jimmy Hoffa, it began like many recent days had begun. He woke early in his home at 4742 Lakeshore Drive in Lake Orion, a comfortable house on the shore of a small lake about 40 miles north of Detroit. At 62 years old, he maintained the habits of a lifetime, early to rise, always active, always thinking about his next move. He had breakfast with Josephine, his wife of 39 years. Joe knew her husband as well as anyone could, and she knew he was restless, frustrated, eager to reclaim his position. They talked about his plans for the day, including a meeting he had scheduled for that afternoon. The meeting was with two men, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Provenzano. According to what Hoffa told Josephine, their purpose was to settle some disputes, to talk through their differences, to reach an understanding that would smooth the way for Hoffa's return to Union leadership. Provenzano and Hoffa had their problems stemming from their time in prison together, but maybe those could be resolved. Giacalone was a Detroit mob figure, but someone Hoffa had known for years. It seemed like a reasonable meeting. Josephine was uneasy about it. She didn't trust Provenzano, and she had heard enough warnings to know that not everyone wanted Jimmy back. But Hoffa dismissed her concerns. "It's just a meeting," he told her. "We're going to talk, that's all. I'll be home for dinner around midnight." Hoffa made some phone calls from his home, handling personal business, talking to a few people about his ongoing legal case. His lawyer was optimistic that the courts would overturn Nixon's restriction. Once that happened, Hoffa could officially declare his candidacy for the 1976 convention. Everything was moving in the right direction. Shortly before 1 p.m., Hoffa changed into a dark blue short-sleeved shirt and dark blue pants, casual but neat, the kind of outfit appropriate for a summer afternoon meeting. He told Josephine he would call her after the meeting. He kissed her goodbye and walked out to his car. His vehicle was a 1974 Pontiac Grandville, a large dark green sedan. Exactly the kind of solid American-made car that a Union man would drive. He got behind the wheel and pulled out of his driveway, heading south toward the Detroit suburbs. The meeting location was the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, an affluent suburb northwest of Detroit. The Red Fox was an upscale establishment popular with business, executives, and professionals, not the kind of place where mob business was typically conducted, which may have been part of what made Hoffa feel the meeting was legitimate. It was public, respectable, out in the open. Hoffa had one stop to make on the way. He drove to an office building in Pontiac, Michigan, where his friend Louis Linteau operated a limousine service. Linteau had been president of Teamsters Local 614 and was now running a small business. Hoffa stopped by to say hello, to chat for a few minutes. It was around 1:15 p.m. He told Linteau about his meeting at the Red Fox, said he'd stop by again afterward. Then he got back in his Pontiac and continued driving. He arrived at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant at approximately 2 p.m. 1000, right on time for his 2 o'clock p.m. meeting. The parking lot was moderately full with the lunch crowd still finishing their meals. Hoffa found a spot and parked his Grandville. He locked the car. Later, investigators would find it unlocked, suggesting he return to it at some point, and walked toward the restaurant entrance. But as he approached, he apparently realized that Giacalone and Provenzano had not arrived yet. Whether he went inside to check or simply looked around the parking lot, the result was the same: they weren't there. For men of their stature in the criminal underworld, punctuality was important. Being late was a sign of disrespect. Their absence must have struck Hoffa as odd. He waited. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt. The temperature was climbing into the mid-80s. Hoffa, dressed in dark clothing, was surely uncomfortable in the heat. 15 minutes passed. At 2:15 p.m., Hoffa walked to a payphone outside the restaurant and called his wife. Josephine answered, and Jimmy's voice came through. "I'm at the Red Fox. The guys haven't shown up yet. I've been stood up. I'm going to wait a little longer, but if they don't show, I'll come home." Josephine heard frustration in his voice, but not alarm. He was annoyed at being made to wait, but not concerned for his safety. "Don't wait too long in this heat." She told him, "Come home." "I will," he promised. "I'll call you later." It was the last time Josephine Hoffa heard her husband's voice. What happened in the next few minutes has been the subject of investigation, speculation, and debate for 50 years. The exact sequence of events may never be known with certainty, but witness accounts and evidence provide some clues. At approximately 2:30 p.m., witnesses in the Red Fox parking lot observed Jimmy Hoffa standing near his car, looking at his watch. Apparently still waiting, he appeared calm, not distressed. One witness, a truck driver whose account has been deemed credible by investigators, reported a crucial detail. He was driving his truck near the Red Fox when a maroon Mercury Marquis broom pulled out of the parking lot suddenly, nearly causing a collision. The driver swerved to avoid the Mercury, and as he did, he glimpsed through the window into the back seat of the Mercury. He saw Jimmy Hoffa. This sighting, if accurate, is enormously significant. It means that Hoffa willingly got into the vehicle. He was not forced or dragged. He went voluntarily, which suggests he recognized the people in the car and trusted them enough to get in. He must have believed he was being taken to the meeting with Giacalone and Provenzano, perhaps at a different location. The maroon Mercury Marquis broom was later identified as a vehicle owned by Joseph Giacalone, son of Tony Giacalone, on the day of Hoffa's disappearance. The car was being driven by Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, who had a heartbreaking relationship to Hoffa. He was, in effect, Hoffa's adopted son. To understand the full tragedy of what likely happened, one must understand Charles O'Brien's relationship to Jimmy Hoffa. O'Brien's mother had worked for the Teamsters, and when O'Brien was young, Hoffa had taken him under his wing. Hoffa treated O'Brien like a son, gave him jobs in the union, mentored him, included him in family gatherings. Barbara and James Hoffa, Jimmy's biological children, considered O'Brien their brother. O'Brien grew up in Hoffa's shadow, benefiting from his patronage, but never quite measuring up to the old man's expectations. He was loyal but not particularly competent, well-meaning but easily influenced. When Hoffa went to prison, O'Brien maintained his position in the union, but his primary loyalty shifted, as did so many others, to Frank Fitzsimmons. By 1975, O'Brien was closer to Fitzsimmons than to Hoffa. He was also connected to Tony Giacalone and other Detroit mob figures. If someone needed a person who could get close to Hoffa, who Hoffa would trust enough to get into a car with, Chucky O'Brien was the perfect choice. And the use of a family member, even an adopted one, to betray Hoffa added a layer of tragedy that would haunt the case forever. On July 30th, 1975, Chucky O'Brien later claimed he spent the afternoon running errands for Jackalone and others. He said he was driving Jackaloni's maroon Mercury, that he had picked up a large salmon from a fish market, around 40 pounds, and that he spent time cleaning the car because the fish had leaked blood. This story, the salmon story, became one of the most infamous alibis in criminal history. When FBI investigators searched the Mercury on August 8, 1975, trained police dogs detected Hoffa's scent in the vehicle. They also found O'Brien's fingerprints on a 7-Up bottle in the car. O'Brien's explanation for the scent was the salmon, that the fish blood and Hoffa's scent could have been confused by the dogs. But investigators and Hoffa's family never believed it. Josephine Hoffa, Barbara Kranzer, and James P. Hoffa were convinced that Chucky O'Brien had driven the car that took Jimmy Hoffa to his death. The evidence pointed to it, the circumstances suggested it, and the betrayal by someone Hoffa considered a son fit the cruelty of the crime. O'Brien denied involvement until his death in 2020, maintaining that he had nothing to do with Hoffa's disappearance, but few believed him. And he carried the stigma of being Hoffa's Judas for the rest of his life. When Jimmy Hoffa didn't call by mid-afternoon, Josephine began to worry by 5 p.m. when he still hadn't returned home or called. She was genuinely concerned. This was completely unlike Jimmy. He always called when he said he would. He was punctual, reliable, considerate about letting her know where he was. She called Louis Linteau, thinking Jimmy might have stopped by his office again. Linteau confirmed that Hoffa had been there around 1:15 p.m., but hadn't returned. He said Jimmy had mentioned the meeting at the Red Fox and expected to be back afterward. Josephine called the Red Fox restaurant. Had they seen her husband? No, the staff said they hadn't noticed him. Their records showed no reservation for a Hoffa party. By evening, Josephine was frightened. She called Barbara and James, who immediately came to Lake Orion. Together, they drove to the Red Fox, searching for any sign of Jimmy in the parking lot. They found his 1974 Pontiac Grandville sitting empty. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were gone. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. They called the Bloomfield Township Police at 7:30 p.m. to report Jimmy Hoffa missing. The police initially treated it as a routine missing person case. Perhaps he had gone somewhere and lost track of time. Perhaps he would turn up with an explanation. But by the next morning, when Hoffa still hadn't appeared, the police and FBI began to understand that this was something far more serious. On July 31, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was officially reported as a missing person. The FBI took over the investigation, launching what would become one of the most extensive and prolonged investigations in Bureau history. The FBI's investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Within days, over 200 FBI agents were assigned to the case. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, executed search warrants, analyzed evidence, and pursued every lead, no matter how implausible. On August 8, 1975, FBI agents obtained a search warrant for the maroon Mercury Marquis broom that had been driven by Chucky O'Brien. They brought in trained police dogs that had been specifically trained to detect human scent. The dogs reacted strongly to the backseat of the vehicle, indicating that they detected Hoffa's scent. This was powerful evidence that Hoffa had been in that car. The investigation also focused on phone records, calls made to and from Hoffa's home, the Red Fox restaurant, and various suspects were analyzed. Travel records were subpoenaed. Financial transactions were examined. The FBI was building a circumstantial case, trying to piece together what had happened from fragments of evidence. On September 2, 1975, a federal grand jury convened to investigate Hoffa's disappearance. Over the following months, numerous witnesses were called to testify. including Chucky O'Brien, Anthony Giacalone, Anthony Provenzano, and dozens of others connected to Hoffa, the Teamsters, or organized crime. The problem was that no one was talking. The code of omerta, the Mafia code of silence, was in full effect. Witnesses claimed not to know anything, invoked their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, or provided alibis that were impossible to definitively disprove. Without a body, without direct witnesses to the crime, without anyone willing to confess or testify, the FBI faced an enormous challenge. By 1976, the FBI had developed an official theory of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. This theory was laid out in an internal document that became known as the Hoffex Memo, a name derived from Hoffa and X for extermination. The memo represented the FBI's best assessment, based on available evidence and intelligence. According to the Hoffex Memo, Jimmy Hoffa's murder was planned by Teamsters officials and organized crime figures who opposed his return to union leadership. The conspiracy involved multiple crime families, primarily the Detroit and New Jersey factions, with approval from higher-level mob bosses, including Russell Bufalino, a powerful Pennsylvania mob figure who had long-standing connections to Hoffa. The motive was straightforward: control of the Teamsters pension fund under Frank Fitzsimmons' leadership. The pension fund had become a reliable source of capital for mob-connected projects. Hoffa's return threatened this arrangement. Hoffa was more independent, more likely to scrutinize loan applications, more difficult to control. His elimination was, from the mob's perspective, a business decision. The plan, according to the FBI's theory, was simple but effective: lure Hoffa to a meeting with the promise of resolving disputes and facilitating his return to power. Have someone he trusts, Chucky O'Brien, pick him up and drive him to a location where hitmen are waiting. Execute him quickly. Dispose of the body in a way that ensures it will never be found. Create alibis for all the key participants. The execution location, according to the FBI, was likely a house in the Detroit area, though the exact location has never been confirmed. The FBI believes Hoffa was killed shortly after getting into the Mercury, possibly within an hour of his disappearance. The method was likely a gunshot to the head, quick, efficient, professional. The body disposal has remained the greatest mystery over the years. The FBI has investigated dozens of theories about where Hoffa's remains might be: buried under Giant Stadium in New Jersey, debunked when the stadium was demolished in 2010 with no body found; ground up and disposed of in a Florida swamp; crushed in a car and shipped to Japan as scrap metal; cremated in a Detroit incinerator; buried in a field in Oakland Township, Michigan. Each theory has been pursued. Each has led to dead ends. Numerous FBI searches over the decades, including excavations, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and cadaver dog searches, have found nothing. The FBI identified several key suspects in Hoffa's disappearance, though none were ever charged with his murder. Anthony "Tony" Giacalone, a powerful enforcer in the Detroit mob. Giacalone was allegedly one of the men Hoffa was supposed to meet at the Red Fox. Giacalone claimed he was nowhere near the restaurant that day. He said he was at a barber shop, an athletic club, and his alibi was supported by witnesses. However, investigators believed these witnesses were lying to protect him. Giacalone was subpoenaed by the grand jury and invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. He was never charged with Hoffa's murder, but was later convicted on unrelated racketeering charges. He died in 2001, taking whatever he knew to his grave. Anthony "Tony" Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official and captain in the Genovese crime family. Provenzano had a bitter feud with Hoffa, stemming from their time together in Lewisburg prison. Like Giacalone, Provenzano claimed to be elsewhere on July 30, 1975. Playing cards at a Teamsters local in New Jersey, his alibi was supported by witnesses. Though investigators suspected these witnesses were providing false testimony, Provenzano was never charged with Hoffa's murder, but was later convicted of other murders and died in prison in 1988. Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, Hoffa's adopted son, and the man most likely to have driven the car that took Hoffa to his death. O'Brien maintained his innocence throughout his life, but the evidence, particularly the scent evidence from the mercury, strongly suggested his involvement. He was never charged, partly because prosecutors felt they couldn't prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt without a body. He died in 2020, still denying any role in Hoffa's disappearance, though the Hoffa family never forgave him. Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Bergoglio, a New Jersey mob associate and suspected triggerman. Bergoglio was allegedly one of the men who actually killed Hoffa. He was known as an enforcer for Provenzano and had a reputation for violence. Bergoglio was never charged with Hoffa's murder, but he was murdered himself in March 1978 in Little Italy. Manhattan, shot multiple times in a classic mob hit. Many believe he was killed to ensure his silence about Hoffa. Gabriel "Gabe" Bergoglio, brother of Sally Bergoglio and another suspected participant. Like his brother, he was never charged and maintained his silence until his death. Russell Bufalino, a Pennsylvania mob boss who allegedly approved Hoffa's killing. Bufalino had been close to Hoffa for decades, but ultimately supported his elimination when Hoffa's return threatened mob interests. Bufalino was convicted on other charges and died in prison in 1994. Frank "the Irishman" Sheeran, a Teamsters official and mob associate who claimed on his deathbed to have been the triggerman who killed Hoffa. Sheeran's confession forms the basis of the book "I Heard You Paint Houses" and the Martin Scorsese film "The Irishman." However, many investigators and scholars doubt Sheeran's account, citing inconsistencies and the improbability that an Irish American would be trusted with such a significant mob hit. Over the years, several people have claimed knowledge of what happened to Hoffa, particularly as they approached death and perhaps felt the need to unburden their consciences. These accounts vary wildly and often contradict each other, but they provide tantalizing possibilities. Frank Sheeran's account. In 2003, as he was dying of cancer, Frank Sheeran told author Charles Brandt that he had killed Jimmy Hoffa. According to Sheeran, Chucky O'Brien drove Hoffa, Sheeran, and Sally Bergoglio from the Red Fox to a house in Detroit. Inside the house, Sheeran said he shot Hoffa twice behind the right ear while Hoffa was looking at his watch. Sheeran claimed the body was then taken to a funeral home with mob connections and cremated. Brandt's book, "I Heard You Paint Houses," was adapted into the 2019 film "The Irishman," starring Robert De Niro as Sheeran and Al Pacino as Hoffa. The film presented Sheeran's account as fact, bringing renewed attention to the case. However, many experts doubt Sheeran's story. Historian David K. Johnston noted that Sheeran's account contains factual errors about Hoffa's life and the timeline of events. More significantly, organized crime experts question whether the mob would have trusted an Irish-American outsider like Sheeran with such a high-profile hit. In Mafia culture, major operations are typically handled by trusted made members or very close associates, not relative outsiders. Additionally, the FBI investigated Sheeran's claims and found no corroborating evidence. The house he described as the murder location has issues with his account. It was too far from the Red Fox to fit the timeline, and searches of the property found nothing. Richard "the Iceman" Kuklinski's claims. Richard Kuklinski, a contract killer who claimed to have murdered over 100 people, told various stories about Hoffa's death. In some versions, he said Hoffa was stuffed into a car that was then crushed and shipped to Japan as scrap metal. In other versions, he provided different accounts. Kuklinski was a notorious fabricator who enjoyed attention, and investigators give little credence to his claims. Charles Allen's account. Charles Allen, a former mob associate, claimed that Hoffa's body was ground up and thrown into the Florida Everglades. Like many such claims, there was no evidence to support it. Donald Tony the Greek, Francos, another criminal who claimed knowledge of Hoffa's fate, saying he was buried under Giant Stadium in New Jersey. When the stadium was demolished in 2010, no body was found, definitively disproving this theory. One of the most credible alternative theories comes from James Buccellato, a professor at Siena Heights University and a scholar of organized crime. In 2017, Buccellato presented research suggesting that Hoffa was killed at a house in northwest Detroit owned by Carlo Licata, son of Detroit mob figure Nick Licata. Buccellato's theory is based on several factors. 1. The Licata house was only about 1 mile from the Red Fox restaurant, making the timeline feasible. 2. The location was familiar to Detroit mob figures and could be quickly accessed. And 3. Most importantly, Buccellato argues that disposing of Hoffa's body locally makes far more sense than elaborate schemes involving New Jersey, Florida, or Japan. It's just not practical, Buccellato explained. To transport a body hundreds of miles, every mile increases the risk of being caught. The most logical scenario is that Hoffa was killed nearby and disposed of nearby, probably in a Detroit incinerator or crematorium, which were then commonly used by the mob for disposing of bodies. In 2013, the FBI searched the area around the Licata house and other nearby locations, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They found nothing conclusive, but the theory remains one of the most plausible explanations. The investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance has never officially closed. Over the decades, the FBI has followed up on numerous leads, conducted multiple searches, and interviewed hundreds of people. Some developments: 2001 to 2003. Deathbed statements from several mob associates renewed interest in the case, though none provided definitive evidence. 2004. The FBI dug up a horse farm in Michigan based on a tip that Hoffa was buried there. Nothing was found. 2006. The FBI searched a Detroit home based on information from a cooperating witness. Again, nothing was found. 2012. Federal authorities searched underneath a driveway in Roseville, Michigan, based on a tip. No body was recovered. 2013. Soil samples were taken from a field in Oakland Township, Michigan. Tests showed no evidence of human remains. 2019. Martin Scorsese's film The Irishman brought the case back into public consciousness, though it presented Frank Sheeran's contested account as factual. 2021. The FBI received information about a possible burial site at a New Jersey landfill. Investigators conducted a search but found nothing. 2023. On what would have been Hoffa's 110th birthday, the FBI reaffirmed that the case remains open and that they continue to follow leads. The reality is that 50 years after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found. The people most directly involved are all dead. The mob families that allegedly ordered his killing have been decimated by prosecutions and leadership changes. The physical evidence has degraded or been lost. The witnesses have died, taking their secrets with them. On December 9, 1982, more than 7 years after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead by a court in Oakland County, Michigan. The declaration was a legal formality. Everyone had known for years that Hoffa was dead, that he wasn't hiding somewhere waiting to return. But the formal declaration brought a kind of closure, at least legally, if not emotionally, by that point. Josephine Hoffa had already died. She passed away on September 12, 1980, never knowing what had happened to her husband, never having the closure of a funeral, never able to lay him to rest properly. The grief and uncertainty of those final 5 years of her life must have been almost unbearable. The legal declaration allowed the family to settle Hoffa's estate and move forward with their lives. Even though the emotional wound would never fully heal, for Barbara and James. The unanswered questions would haunt them for decades. Who had killed their father? Where was his body? Had Chucky O'Brien, the man they had considered a brother, really betrayed him? Would they ever know the truth? In 1995, 20 years after the disappearance, the Hoffa family held a memorial service without a body to bury. It was a symbolic ceremony, a chance to publicly mourn and remember Jimmy Hoffa. Friends, former Teamsters members, and supporters attended. They shared stories of Hoffa's dedication to working people, his incredible work ethic, his loyalty to his members. But the mystery remained, and it remains to this day. The tragedy of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance extended far beyond his own death. It devastated his family and cast a long shadow over their lives. Josephine Pashiwak Hoffa lived for 5 years after her husband's disappearance, dying on September 12, 1980, at age 62. Those 5 years must have been a special kind of torture, not knowing what happened, holding on to faint hope that perhaps Jimmy would return, gradually accepting that he was gone, but never having closure. She never got to bury her husband, never got to grieve properly. Friends reported that she remained dignified throughout her ordeal. But the pain was evident. She died of a heart attack. But many believe she died of a broken heart. Barbara Krancer, Jimmy and Josephine's daughter, was 37 years old when her father disappeared. She refused to let the tragedy define her life. She became a lawyer, then a judge in St. Louis, Missouri, serving as a Missouri Circuit Judge and later as Assistant Attorney General. She raised her family, built a distinguished career, and carried herself with the same dignity and strength her mother had shown. But she never stopped seeking answers. For decades, Barbara pursued leads, talked to investigators, pressed the FBI to keep the case active. She was convinced, and remains convinced, that Chucky O'Brien, the man she had considered a brother, was involved in her father's murder. The betrayal was almost as painful as the loss itself. She refused to speak to O'Brien for the rest of his life, rejecting his repeated denials of involvement in interviews over the years. Barbara has spoken about her father with a mixture of love, pride, and clear-eyed realism. She acknowledges his flaws and his questionable associations, but she emphasizes his dedication to working people and his genuine commitment to improving their lives. James P. Hoffa, Jimmy and Josephine's son, was 34 years old when his father disappeared, unlike his sister, who pursued a legal career outside the labor movement. James followed directly in his father's footsteps. He became a labor lawyer and eventually a Teamsters official in 1998. He was elected General President of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the same position his father had held 30 years earlier. James P. Hoffa served as Teamsters President from 1998 to 2022, a tenure that eventually surpassed even his father's time in the position. During his presidency, he worked to reform the union, to distance it from its corrupt past, and to rebuild its reputation and power. He negotiated major contracts, organized new members, and dealt with the challenges of a changing economy. But the ghost of his father's disappearance followed him throughout his career. Critics questioned whether he could ever escape his father's shadow. Supporters saw his election as a vindication of Jimmy Hoffa's legacy. James himself was diplomatic about his father's controversial history, defending his achievements while acknowledging his mistakes. In 2023, the Indiana Historical Bureau erected a historical marker in Brazil, Indiana, Jimmy Hoffa's birthplace, commemorating his life and legacy. The marker acknowledges both his achievements for working people and the mystery of his disappearance. For the Hoffa family, it was a small but meaningful recognition that history had not forgotten their father and husband, even if his final resting place remained unknown. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance had profound effects on the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In the short term, it eliminated the threat to Frank Fitzsimmons' leadership. Fitzsimmons continued as general president until his death in 1981, maintaining the cozy relationship with organized crime and the political connections with the Republican Party that had developed during Hoffa's imprisonment. But Hoffa's disappearance also triggered increased scrutiny of the Teamsters from federal law enforcement. The FBI's investigation into Hoffa's murder led investigators deeper into the union's connections with organized crime. The Justice Department launched a sustained effort to root out mob influence in the union, an effort that would continue for decades. In 1988, the federal government filed a civil RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, lawsuit against the Teamsters, alleging that the union had been infiltrated and controlled by organized crime. Rather than fight the lawsuit through years of litigation, the Teamsters agreed to a consent decree that placed the union under federal oversight. An independent review board was established to investigate and remove corrupt officials. Direct elections for union officers replaced the convention-based system that had been more easily manipulated. This federal oversight lasted for decades, gradually reducing mob influence in the union. By the time James P. Hoffa became president in 1998, the Teamsters was a cleaner organization than it had been in his father's era. The consent decree was finally lifted in 2020, marking the end of 30 years of federal supervision. Whether Jimmy Hoffa would have approved of these changes is an interesting question. On one hand, the removal of mob influence meant the union was run more honestly and transparently. On the other hand, many argue that the federal oversight weakened the union, that the Teamsters under government supervision lost some of the aggressive militancy that had made it powerful under Hoffa's leadership. What's undeniable is that Jimmy Hoffa's tenure represented the peak of Teamsters' power at its height under Hoffa. The union had over 23 million members and enormous political and economic influence. By the early 2000s, membership had declined significantly as the economy shifted away from manufacturing and transportation. And as union membership declined generally in the United States, the Teamsters remained a major union. But it never again achieved the dominance it had during the Hoffa era. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance marked a turning point in the federal government's war on organized crime. The brazen nature of the crime, the disappearance of one of the most prominent figures in America, shocked the public and galvanized law enforcement. In the years following Hoffa's disappearance, the FBI intensified its investigations of mob families across the country. New legal tools, including the RICO statute, gave prosecutors powerful weapons against organized crime. Cooperating witnesses, mob members who agreed to testify in exchange for lighter sentences, began to break the code of omerta. Through the 1980s and 1990s, federal prosecutors systematically dismantled the leadership of mob families in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and other cities. Bosses who had seemed untouchable went to prison. The mob's control over labor unions was broken or severely weakened. The power and influence that organized crime had wielded for decades was dramatically reduced. Many of the mob figures connected to Hoffa's disappearance were eventually prosecuted and imprisoned, not for Hoffa's murder, but for other crimes. Anthony Provenzano died in prison in 1988 while serving a life sentence for murder. Russell Bufalino died in prison in 1994. Others were convicted on racketeering charges, loan sharking, extortion, and various other crimes. The Mafia still exists in America, but it is a shadow of what it once was. The glamorous or notorious era of powerful mob bosses who controlled major industries and corrupted labor unions is largely over. And Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance played a role in motivating the law enforcement campaign that brought about that decline. 50 years after his disappearance, how should we assess Jimmy Hoffa's life and legacy? He remains one of the most controversial figures in American history, a man who inspired fierce loyalty and bitter hatred, who achieved remarkable successes and engaged in undeniable corruption, who fought for working people while associating with criminals. Jimmy Hoffa's greatest achievement was the transformation of working conditions for American truckers and transportation workers. When he became Teamsters president in 1957, truck drivers were poorly paid, lacked job security, had minimal benefits, and were treated as disposable labor. By the time he went to prison a decade later, those same workers had middle-class incomes, health insurance, pensions, and dignity. The 1964 National Master Freight Agreement was a revolutionary achievement, the largest collective bargaining agreement in American history up to that point, covering over 400,000 workers under a single contract that guaranteed uniform wages and conditions across the country. This single accomplishment improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of families and contributed to the growth of the American middle class in the post-war era. Hoffa was also ahead of his time on civil rights, refusing to tolerate segregated locals and supporting Martin Luther King Jr. When many Americans, including many in the labor movement, viewed King as too radical, his commitment to racial equality in the Union was genuine and consequential. He was extraordinarily accessible to rank-and-file members, publishing his office phone number and actually taking calls from workers with grievances. He worked 20-hour days, 6 days a week, traveling constantly to visit locals and maintain direct contact with members. His dedication was legendary and authentic. Congressman Elmer Holland's assessment that Jimmy Hoffa has put more bread and butter on the tables for American kids than all his detractors put together contains substantial truth. Millions of working families lived better lives because of contracts Hoffa negotiated and the power he built for the Teamsters. But Hoffa's achievements came at a significant moral cost. His alliances with organized crime were extensive and consequential. The Teamsters Pension Fund, which should have been a sacred trust providing retirement security for members, became a slush fund for mob-connected projects. Hundreds of millions of dollars in loans went to casinos, hotels, and businesses controlled by or connected to organized crime figures. While Hoffa himself may not have personally enriched himself substantially from these dealings, he enabled and facilitated corruption that harmed the members he claimed to serve. Pension fund assets that should have been invested wisely for maximum returns for retirees were instead loaned on favorable terms to mob figures. Some of these loans were never repaid. The fund's performance suffered. Hoffa's willingness to use violence and intimidation in labor disputes, while perhaps necessary in the rough and tumble environment of mid-century labor relations, also contributed to the perception of unions as thuggish organizations. This perception was exploited by anti-labor forces and contributed to declining public support for unions in later decades. His convictions for jury tampering and pension fund fraud were not unjust political persecution. There was substantial evidence supporting both convictions. While Robert Kennedy's pursuit of Hoffa was certainly personal and perhaps overzealous, Hoffa was not innocent of the crimes he was convicted of committing. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that Jimmy Hoffa was a product and reflection of his time, an era when the lines between legitimate labor organizing and criminal activity were often blurred, when both employers and unions used violence and intimidation, when moral compromises were seen as necessary for survival and success. Historian Arthur Sloan, who wrote the most comprehensive biography of Hoffa, noted that people were polarized. In their views, some saw him as a latter-day Al Capone, while others saw him as hugely successful in improving working conditions for his members. Both views contained truth. Hoffa was, as Sloan put it, a concentrated reflection of his ruthless environment. Robert F. Kennedy called Hoffa the most powerful man in America aside from the president. That assessment, coming from an enemy, spoke to the reality of Hoffa's influence at his peak. He commanded the loyalty of over 2 million workers, controlled billions of dollars in pension assets, and wielded enormous political power. Few labor Leaders before or since have achieved comparable influence. The tragedy is that Hoffa's legitimate achievements, the contracts he negotiated, the wages he raised, the dignity he brought to working people, are forever shadowed by his criminal associations, by the mysterious circumstances of his death. His story became a cautionary tale rather than a triumphant narrative, beyond his actual historical significance. Jimmy Hoffa has become a permanent fixture in American popular culture and mythology. His disappearance has taken on a life of its own, becoming shorthand for unsolved mysteries and the power of organized crime. Hoffa's life and disappearance have been the subject of numerous films and television programs. Hoffa, 1992, directed by Danny DeVito and starring Jack Nicholson as Hoffa. This Hollywood biopic dramatized Hoffa's rise to power, his battles with Robert Kennedy, and his eventual disappearance. While taking significant creative liberties with historical facts, the film captured something essential about Hoffa's personality and the era he inhabited. Nicholson's performance, intense, charismatic, and combustible, became the popular image of Hoffa for many Americans. The Irishman, 2019, Martin Scorsese's epic crime film starring Robert De Niro as Frank Sheeran and Al Pacino as Hoffa, presented Sheeran's account of killing Hoffa. Despite scholarly doubts about Sheeran's confession, the film treated it as factual, bringing renewed attention to the case and introducing Hoffa's story to a new generation. The film's meditation on loyalty, betrayal, and the consequences of a violent life resonated with audiences and critics. Numerous documentaries, the Discovery Channel, History Channel, A&E, and other networks have produced countless documentaries examining Hoffa's life and disappearance, each exploring different theories and interviewing various witnesses and experts. Hoffa's name has become a cultural reference point. Where's Jimmy Hoffa? Jokes are ubiquitous when something goes missing. Construction projects joke about finding Hoffa buried in the foundation. The phrase "pulling a Hoffa" has entered the vernacular to mean disappearing without a trace. This cultural immortality is ironic. Hoffa would probably have preferred to be remembered for the National Master Freight Agreement, and not for jokes about being buried under Giant Stadium. But the mystery of his disappearance has given him a kind of immortality that his legitimate achievements alone might not have provided. Dozens of books have been written about Hoffa, ranging from academic biographies to true crime investigations to conspiracy theories. Charles Brandt's "I Heard You Paint Houses" became a bestseller and the basis for The Irishman, Arthur Sloane's scholarly biography, remains the most comprehensive and balanced account. Hoffa's own autobiographies, The Trials of Jimmy Hoffa and Hoffa, The Real Story, provide his perspective, though they must be read critically given their obvious bias. The continued fascination with Hoffa speaks to several enduring American obsessions: organized crime and its power, corruption in high places, unsolved mysteries, the dark side of the American dream, and the question of whether the ends justify the means. After examining 50 years of investigation, testimony, confessions, and theories, what can we conclude with reasonable confidence about what happened to Jimmy Hoffa on July 30th, 1975? While certainty is impossible without a confession or body, the most credible scenario, supported by the FBI's investigation and accepted by most serious researchers, is as follows. The setup: Jimmy Hoffa was lured to the Macha's Red Fox restaurant under the pretense of a meeting with Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano to discuss resolving their disputes and smoothing the way for Hoffa's return to Teamsters leadership. The meeting was a trap. Neither Giacalone nor Provenzano ever intended to be there. The pickup, Chucky O'Brien, driving a maroon Mercury Marquis broom owned by Joe Giacalone, picked up Hoffa from the Red Fox parking lot around 2:30 p.m. Hoffa got into the car willingly because he trusted O'Brien, the young man he had treated like a son. There were likely one or two other men in the car, possibly including Salvatore Bragaglio. The murder: Hoffa was driven to a house in the Detroit area. Possibly the Carlo Licata house, possibly another location where he was killed, likely by a gunshot to the head. The killing happened quickly, within an hour of his disappearance from the Red Fox. It was a professional hit, carried out efficiently by experienced killers. The disposal. Hoffa's body was disposed of locally, most likely through cremation at a mob-connected funeral home or incineration at an industrial facility. The idea that his body was transported to New Jersey or Florida is implausible given the risks involved. The Detroit mob had local resources for body disposal, and using them minimized exposure. The cover-up. All participants had prepared alibis. Giacalone claimed to be at a barber shop and athletic club. Provenzano claimed to be playing cards at a Union Hall in New Jersey. O'Brien claimed to be running errands and cleaning fish blood from the car. Witnesses were prepared to support these alibis. The Code of Omerta ensured silence from anyone who knew the truth. The motive. The decision to kill Hoffa came from high-level mob leadership, likely involving Russell Bufalino and leaders of several crime families. The motive was simple: Hoffa's return to Teamsters. Leadership threatened the mob's control of the pension fund and their comfortable relationship with Frank Fitzsimmons. It was a business decision. Hoffa had become more valuable dead than alive. This scenario explains all the known facts: the scent evidence in O'Brien's car, the timing of events, the absence of a body, the lack of witnesses, and the subsequent behavior of the suspects. While details remain uncertain, this general outline is almost certainly close to what actually happened. Even accepting the most likely scenario, significant questions remain. Where exactly was Hoffa killed? The specific location has never been definitively identified. Various houses have been searched, but no physical evidence has been found. The passage of time has made this question perhaps impossible to answer with certainty. Where are his remains? This is the question that haunts Hoffa's family and the public imagination. If he was cremated, as seems most likely, his ashes could be anywhere scattered, buried, disposed of in any number of ways. The chance of ever finding physical remains grows smaller with each passing year. Who specifically pulled the trigger? Salvatore Bergoglio is the most commonly suspected triggerman, but he was murdered in 1978, and we will never have his testimony. Frank Sheeran claimed to have done it, but his account is disputed. The actual shooter's identity may never be known with certainty. Why did Hoffa walk into the trap? Knowing what we know now, it seems obvious that the meeting was a setup. But Hoffa was an experienced operator who had navigated the dangerous world of mob-connected labor politics for decades. Why didn't his instincts warn him? Perhaps his desperation to return to power clouded his judgment. Perhaps his ego made him believe he was still powerful enough that no one would dare harm him. Perhaps he simply trusted the wrong people. What role did Frank Fitzsimmons play? Fitzsimmons clearly benefited from Hoffa's disappearance, and he had the motive to want Hoffa gone. But was he actively involved in planning the murder, or was he simply a passive beneficiary? The evidence suggests he at least knew what was going to happen, but his exact role remains unclear. He died in 1981 without ever being charged, and could Hoffa have been saved? If he had heeded the warnings, if he had accepted that his time had passed, if he had retired gracefully, would he have lived? Almost certainly, yes, but that wasn't in Hoffa's nature. He was a fighter who never backed down, and that quality, which had served him so well throughout his career, ultimately led him to his death. Looking at the American labor movement today from the vantage point of 2025, Jimmy Hoffa's era seems like ancient history. The world of mid-century American labor powerful unions, militant organizing, master contracts covering hundreds of thousands of workers has largely disappeared. Union membership in the United States has declined dramatically from its peak of about 35% of the workforce in the 1950s to roughly 10% today. The Teamsters, while still significant, has far fewer members than during Hoffa's presidency. The manufacturing and transportation sectors that were the backbone of Union strength have been hollowed out by automation, globalization, and the shift to a service economy. The aggressive organizing tactics that Hoffa employed, secondary boycotts, sympathy strikes, hot cargo agreements, have been restricted or outlawed by subsequent labor legislation. The master contracts that standardized wages across entire industries have largely given way to company by company, or even workplace by workplace negotiations. The political power that unions wielded during Hoffa's era has diminished as membership has declined. Yet there are signs of renewed interest in labor organizing, particularly among younger workers. The 2020s have seen successful union campaigns at major corporations, increased strike activity, and growing public support for unions. Whether this represents a genuine resurgence of labor power or merely a temporary uptick remains to be seen. What would Jimmy Hoffa make of today's labor movement? He would probably be frustrated by its weakness compared to his era, but also energized by opportunities to organize. He would likely embrace new technologies and tactics, while maintaining his fundamental belief that workers need collective power to counterbalance corporate power. He would probably be appalled by declining membership, but inspired by workers willing to fight for their rights. His legacy in the labor movement is mixed. He demonstrated what unions could achieve through aggressive organization and militant tactics. But he also contributed to the public perception of unions as corrupt and mob-connected, a perception that made it easier for anti-labor forces to undermine union power in subsequent decades. As of 2025, the FBI's investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains officially open. Special Agent Mara Schneider, who leads the Detroit FBI office, stated on the 50th anniversary of Hoffa's disappearance in 2025, "This case is not closed. We continue to follow credible leads." The FBI is committed to bringing closure to the Hoffa family and to justice in this case. But realistically, the chances of solving the case grow slimmer with each passing year. All the main suspects are now dead. Potential witnesses who might have had information have died of natural causes. Physical evidence has degraded or been lost. Memories have faded. The mob families that ordered the hit have been prosecuted and decimated by decades of law enforcement pressure. The most likely scenario for finally solving the case would be if someone, perhaps a dying mob associate who wants to clear his conscience, provides credible information about the location of Hoffa's remains. Advances in forensic technology mean that even trace evidence might now be detectable and identifiable. Ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, and other tools are more sophisticated than they were in 1975. But finding remains after 50 years, especially if the body was cremated or disposed of in water or industrial facilities, is extraordinarily difficult. The FBI has investigated hundreds of leads and tips over the decades, conducted numerous searches, and examined countless theories. Despite this massive effort, they have never found definitive evidence. The case file on Hoffa's disappearance consists of over 70 volumes, more than 16,000 pages of investigative reports, witness statements, search warrants, surveillance logs, and analysis. It represents one of the most exhaustive investigations in FBI history. Yet, it has not produced an arrest or conviction. At some point, likely in the not-too-distant future, the FBI will have to accept that the case simply cannot be solved. The last witnesses will have died, the physical evidence will be irretrievable, and the passage of time will have made justice impossible. The case may remain officially open, but actively investigating it will no longer be practical when that day comes. Jimmy Hoffa will join the ranks of America's permanent unsolved mysteries, alongside D.B. Cooper, the Zodiac Killer, and others whose fate will never be known with certainty. His disappearance will remain a symbol of mob power, of justice denied, and of mysteries that refuse to surrender their secrets. In interviews over the past 5 decades, Barbara Crancer and James P. Hoffa have spoken repeatedly about their father, his legacy, and the unresolved mystery of his disappearance. Their words provide insight into how the family has coped with the tragedy and how they want their father remembered. Barbara Crancer, in a 2020 interview, said, "My father was a complex man. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He got involved with people he shouldn't have. But at his core, he truly cared about working people. He fought for them every single day of his life. He gave them dignity, security, and hope. That's what I want people to remember about him, not the mystery of how he died, but the meaning of how he lived," she continued. "Not having closure has been incredibly difficult. Not knowing where my father is buried, not being able to visit his grave. Not having answers, it's a wound that never heals. But I've made peace with the fact that we may never know exactly what happened. What I do know is that people who claim to be his friends betrayed him, and I hope that somewhere, somehow justice will be served, if not in this life." Then in the next, James P. Hoffa, shortly before retiring as Teamsters president in 2022, reflected, "Growing up as Jimmy Hoffa's son was complicated. There was pride in what he accomplished, but also the shadow of controversy and, ultimately, the tragedy of his disappearance. When I became Teamsters president, I wanted to honor his legitimate legacy, his fight for working families, while making clear that the union had moved beyond the corruption of that era." He added, "I've spent my life in the labor movement because I believe in the cause my father dedicated his life to, giving working people a voice, fair wages, dignity on the job. That cause is as important today as it was in his time, maybe more important. My father's life teaches us that the fight for workers' rights is never finished, and that we must fight with integrity as well as courage." Both siblings have expressed hope that someday, before they die, they will finally learn what happened to their father and where his remains are. But as they enter their 80s, that hope grows dimmer. They have prepared themselves for the possibility that they will die without answers, just as their mother did on July 30th, 2025, exactly 50 years after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. A small ceremony was held at the Matcha's Red Fox restaurant parking lot in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. The restaurant itself had long since closed and been demolished, replaced by a commercial development, but the location is marked with a plaque commemorating the event that made it famous. About 50 people attended the ceremony, a few elderly former Teamsters members who had known Hoffa personally, some members of the Hoffa family, local historians, journalists, and curious onlookers. It was a modest gathering for a man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions. One elderly man, a retired truck driver named Frank Castellano, who had worked under Hoffa's contracts, spoke to reporters. "I'm 87 years old now, and I've been retired for 22 years. I get a pension, I have health benefits. I've got Social Security, I raised 3 kids, sent them to college, bought a house, lived a good middle-class life. And I owe a lot of that to Jimmy Hoffa and what he fought for. Say what you want about his connections or his methods, but he fought for working people. He put food on our tables and dignity in our hearts. That's what I remember about him." Another speaker, a labor historian from Wayne State University, offered a more academic assessment. Jimmy Hoffa represents a particular moment in American labor history, a time when unions were powerful enough to reshape the economy, when working-class Americans could negotiate for a share of prosperity, when collective action could counterbalance corporate power. His methods were often questionable. His associations were clearly corrupt, but his achievements were real and substantial. The decline of labor power since his era has corresponded with growing inequality and declining economic security for working families. We don't need to excuse his corruption to recognize that the cause he fought for remains relevant. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, not just for Jimmy Hoffa, but for all the people whose lives were touched by his work, and for the ideal he represented, that working people deserve dignity, security, and a fair share of the prosperity their labor creates. As the sun set that evening over the Detroit suburbs, casting long shadows across the parking lot where Hoffa had last been seen 50 years earlier, one truth seemed clear: Jimmy Hoffa may have vanished without a trace. But his legacy, complex, controversial, and consequential, endures. He was the coal miner's son who became one of the most powerful men in America. He was the union leader who raised wages and improved lives for millions of families. He was the ally of organized crime who compromised his achievements through corruption. He was the fighter who never backed down, even when backing down might have saved his life. He was the man who vanished into legend, leaving behind more questions than answers, more controversy than clarity, more mystery than resolution. In the end, perhaps that's fitting. Jimmy Hoffa was always larger than life, always controversial, always defying simple categorization. His disappearance, frustrating as it is for those seeking closure, has ensured that his story remains alive in the American consciousness. He has become more than a man. He has become a symbol, a legend, a mystery that refuses to be solved. And maybe that's exactly what Jimmy Hoffa would have wanted. Not to be forgotten, not to fade into obscurity, but to remain forever present in the American imagination. A man who fought for working people, who battled presidents and mobsters, who built an empire and lost everything, who walked into a parking lot on a hot July afternoon in 1975 and vanished into history. The mystery endures, the questions remain. And that's the complete, untold story of Jimmy Hoffa, from a coal miner's son who built the most powerful union in America to the man who vanished into legend on a hot July afternoon in 1975. 50 years later, we still don't know what happened to his body. The FBI case remains open, the mystery endures. But now you know the full story, the rise, the power, the corruption, the battles, and the disappearance that changed American history. If you found this deep dive fascinating, do me a huge favor, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves true crime, history, or unsolved mysteries. Leave a comment and tell me, what's your theory on what happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Where do you think his body ended up? And most importantly, if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We create long-form, deeply researched content just like this, covering the most fascinating stories in history. Thanks for sticking with me through this incredible journey. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop searching for the truth.